who's going to lead it, who's going to command it, who's going to be in charge of policy, etc., etc. You know, this is a huge undertaking. But of course, this is not NATO, right? Now, NATO worked very, very successfully. NATO was obviously something Clement Attlee gifted us. And remember, he didn't like the EU. He thought it was a dictatorship of bureaucrats. Him and Churchill were in line with that. So the procurement really is the way that they'll pivot forward from this. And they'll do it with the jobs and the capital budgets. But you know, once you start to lose cardinal values of capital procurement budgets, and then your operational budgets become questionable, you know, at what point then do you say, well, this is, you know, this is a good idea because we're not having autonomy in defence and security. We're a rule taker from the EU because they, you know, they're calling all of the literally the shots.
David, what can the general public do? And, you know, there are more of them, but there are more of us than there are of them. Most people, and you and I have been talking to people this weekend, and, you know, the people that we deal with all understand what is going on. But what can we possibly do to get this stopped? Is there anything?
Yes, the only instrument to do anything about this is Parliament. So there has to be resistance. Campaigning. Silence is consent in this country. So if you are silent, it doesn't matter who you are. You can be the MP if you're silent in Parliament, and Parliament is silent, and it's consenting to this. It's allowing the Prime Minister to do it under the prerogatives. So you need a situation where you're pressing your MP to the extent where they will raise it in Parliament. Now, Jim Allister currently, as I understand, I don't know if there's any others, but Jim Allister of Northern Ireland is trying to raise this as a debate, and he's being blocked because there isn't enough MPs raising it. Now it's Parliament's job to scrutinise and challenge what the government are doing, and as yet this is unchallenged. So it will require you and groups in your constituency to press and lobby your MP.
Right.
There is no other. You don't get to talk to Ollie Robbins. You don't get to talk to Chris Wormold. You don't vote for either of those two chaps, right? Or what they're doing. But the only bit you do have is your MP, and it doesn't matter whether it's a Labour MP or a Tory MP or a Liberal MP or a Reform MP for that matter. And I'm encouraged that Jim Allister is taking this up. He's got a terrific researcher called Dan Boucher. I'd like to give him some credit. He's doing some good work. And we need more of this. There were a few, you know, there were stirrings in the referendum with the ERG to move on this, but they were continually nobbled and blocked by the whips. But it's up to them to overcome that. If they don't see the destination of what von der Leyen is talking about and see that as a significant critical risk in terms of autonomy, then I don't know. Then they shouldn't be an MP. Then you need to campaign against them and get them out of their seat and get somebody in the seat that will.
What, you know, we've had a new party come to Parliament recently. It's called Reform, with Nigel Farage. Now, what is your understanding where Reform sit on this, bearing in mind that the Colonel you mentioned has been, if you like, through ill health, is no longer there. So what is your take on Reform? Perhaps Rupert no.
Well, he's sitting as an independent now. Well, interestingly, Rupert did ask some questions about ammunition and the ammunition problems that we got, which are correct. He's entirely correct. And he was talking about procurement. And then I think the following week, he was barreled out of Reform quick fashion. Where Frederick Cheetham was concerned, so all of this sort of what we're discussing now was all oven ready to go into the challenge in the general election. But unfortunately, the chap had a heart attack and then it stalled. I did find a couple of volunteers. One was a rear admiral and another was a general that were happy to take up the Reform position of being defence spokesperson, but it wasn't expedited by people in charge at the top of the party, and basically what was an oven-ready campaign never happened, and it didn't get expedited, and essentially the party went quiet on it. Now, the party are fully aware of this because I know that both Frederick and I and others have briefed them. They're fully aware of all the critical details, and there isn't really an excuse that I know of, or at least nobody's given me an excuse as to why this is not being taken up, because obviously Anne Widdecombe did in G19, and as I said, you know, when I was working her on this, and she put it down and made the challenge. What happened is Boris paused. What he said, it was the wording of the deal was changed from "you will sign in" under what was on the table from Theresa May to "we would consider it." So basically, Boris didn't do either. So it wasn't an opt-in or an opt-out, but because Boris was silent and basically just parked the whole matter during his term, that he did nothing. So because of the nothing, there was silence. So rather than the awareness of what was looming and happening, now bearing in mind, this is in the context of war in Europe. So you would think a greater conversation on how fighting capability would be brought forward, that would be something we would want to go into. So I'm back to my conversation with Admiral Lord Boyce about having the greater debate about defence and security and what we're going to do with it, because obviously he and Nigel Esnay and a lot of other military officers at the time were pushing back against what the government were doing, what Cameron and Blair had been doing with reducing our fighting capability. Now, my understanding is that obviously they were pitching this as cuts and, you know, peace dividend and all the rest of it. Just as a data point, ladies and gentlemen, you do know that Tony Blair helped Putin get elected, right? That's a fact, right? So we had a series of prime ministers that were both well, he had to have been at the time pro-Russian, otherwise why would he have helped Putin get elected? He was also pro-EU. And then we have a series of and pro-China because of obviously they were hell-bent on getting China in everything in the country. And then we have Cameron come along, who's pro-China and pro-EU. So, you know, we've had woeful policy in terms of our national policy for quite some time. And they've got, you know, clearly got, both of them have got that wrong. No ifs, no buts. So, you know, NATO has been a successful arrangement, and it has kept the peace. But it did that with the strength of national capabilities coming together. And of course, that's the critical bit. Now, what I understand is the concept is, well, the adversaries have this much power militarily, and collectively in Europe, we have twice as much if you add it all up. So we can all reduce nationally, and it can all be low. That can be fine. That's not a problem anymore. We can do that, and then we can spend the money on whatever else, right? Now, of course, that's a load of nonsense, okay? Because all the while this ridiculousness is going on, it has this thing called time. And as Wellington taught us, timing is quite critical in this sort of thing. So lessons of battle, lessons of war, yeah? And it's militaries that fight battles and countries fight wars. So what we have now in the period of all of this is war in Europe. Hey presto, who knew? Crikey, who knew that this would come? And I've had met with countless senior military officers, and you could go all the way through the ranks, and the private at the other end would tell you the same. We shouldn't be cutting, and yet they did, right? Because the threat was still there, and the threat's worse now than it was before. So, you know, back in the days when it was SS-20s and now it's hypersonics, you know, and this is a real serious problem with attack to defense cost ratios with this stuff. And now we've got this drone thing, which is a complete game changer because of the way that the battles are being fought, all right, and the way that works in terms of the ratios in the area, the personnel ratios and the systems ratios in the you know the physical space of you know, so many square miles, and what happens within that, you know, it's and the energy weapons and everything. It's a complete game changer. So yes, a lot of our stuff's obsolete. I think everybody accepts that, and we need to adapt. And the question is adapting quickly. So we're back to our, can we have the greater debate? Can we have the awareness? But we've got single point procurement really in this country already with BAE. They're the governments here. You remember back in the 50s and 60s, Liz, that they unified they went for the aircraft first. That's Duncan Sandys. Obviously, EU movement. Hello, anyone? And then pitching everyone Pan-Avia Tornado. So that was the first attempt at group common procurement, Pan-Avia Tornado, and we now see that again with the Typhoon. But people, I always love it in this country because they go, it's RAF Typhoon. No, it's an Airbus, right? Jag de Flugzeug, it's an Airbus, right? So you're going to see Airbus get into military stuff further beyond that, you know. And BAE used to make wings. They don't even do that anymore. They sold their wing capability to Airbus, so we don't even have that. We don't have an interest in that anymore. That's shocking, really. So how do we get out of this mess? Because obviously we either need to physically stop this problem or get it to a degree where our fighting capability is so scary that it deters anybody from doing anything. Well, it's not at that point yet, clearly.
No, David, I think you've covered really everything. And as I say, the most important thing, I think, is that there are so many, if I say normal people, who completely understand what you're saying and just feel powerless. And if the only way is to lobby your MP, then so be it. But it is real serious stuff. And of course, the other reason why they all want to go in is it's so much easier for other people to make decisions. So you've got our civil service must be the laziest bunch of people on the planet, because all they do is send everything over and sit back on their laurels, and everything comes back from Brussels and says, you do this, and they implement it instead of sorting out the policy in the first place. They are the laziest bunch of people and the most treasonous.
Well, I think they've been. I think they wouldn't have been lazy at the moment. They'd have been busily engaged getting this through. So, you know, look, they see this as a solution. They see this as a good thing. It was a critical thing for Blair, and we're still under that mantle. Now, of course, you know, this people need to understand the way that our governance system is, and I think we can agree that it's not working at the moment. A lot of people say it's broken or whatever, but we don't live in a democracy, or a pure democracy. We live in a constitutional monarchy, and it's a tripartite power sharing arrangement post the 1688 Glorious Revolution, where we're supposed to have a democratically led sharing arrangement. So your MP, and then, you know, the crown is the constant part, so that's 1/3 of it, with the monarch at the end of it, who has a constitutional role to uphold the laws and enactments agreed upon in Parliament. Now, part of that constitutional framework is that we're not supposed to be subordinating to any foreign power, prince or potentate. All right, they're not supposed to be doing that. All right, that's not in the deal. That's not in the limits of what Parliament or the Crown is allowed to do under the constitutional arrangements. We do have a constitution in England. There isn't a constitution for Britain because Britain is a union. What we have is a series of documents, not a document. You will often hear people go, we haven't got a constitution. Well, we have a series of documents, the Bill of Rights being one of them, that form the foundation of it. So the power sharing is supposed to be between the Crown, which is the permanent part, where the civil service lays now, and the Crown corporate within the Cabinet Office, which is effectively the engine room of the government and the Crown. And that's supposed to be shared between the Lords. So Commons, Lords, Crown. That's a three-way sharing arrangement where we're supposed to share power and everybody get along, and we're all supposed to profit by it. Well, of course, that's not happening. That's not working, because now what we've got is and this is what I find astonishing with people like Suella Braverman and Steve Baker and all the rest of them, and David Davis, all on the Leave side of the argument, talking about how they couldn't get anything done and the civil service was stopping them. Well, it's supposed to be democratically led, but of course, what we now understand is that Tony Blair flipped the power from the ministers to the civil servants. So so what we've got now is the 23 permanent secretaries are effectively it, right? So the ministers can just say yes. Now, as Dominic Cummings has whistleblown superbly, is that what happens is the entire thing is scripted. and the minister turns up with a script, and then the answers are scripted, and then the further and betters are scripted, and then what you're going to do is scripted, and they can only say yes. Now, if you say no, interesting things start to happen to them, and they normally end up resigning, or there's some sort of scandal. So that's not what we're supposed to have. But of course, socialism, this is what you get. So as we were warned by Churchill, and I think this is quite apt that we do this on Dynamo Day, Dunkirk Day today, is that there is no difference between communism and socialism. The only difference, there's certainly no difference in theory or principle. The only difference is method and the way that the socialists go about trying to get their agenda and their policy through by constitutional means. Of course, the communists don't do that. They do that by revolution. Now, as he famously said, the socialists are the tools and the lackeys of the oligarchy. Now, at the time, he cited Moscow, but we could widen that to global oligarchy because essentially they've got a quasi-communist approach. So that stands. Now, what he then said is if you carry on with socialism, you will end up with police that are political police, and you will end up with civil service no longer being civil and no longer being servants. And this is where we are. We are at that inflection point, ladies and gentlemen, because we have political policing because of socialism. We have political judiciary, thanks to Starmer, and we have political justice now.
Or injustice.
Or injustice if you're the other side of it, correct. Because if your politics doesn't suit, you are offside, aren't you? And you get a good shoeing. So that, I think, is quite apt because Churchill, I think, it was superb in so many respects because obviously, you know, what with us to celebrating VE Day and the sacrifices that our services made at the time in order to win the battles and the country win the war, that his policy was quite straightforward. You know, we would fight and we would have to have victory because without victory, there was nothing. And that is the spirit we need to kind of get through this period, because make no bones about it, Europe is at war again.
Yeah. And
we need to think about these lessons of battle and these lessons of war and these salient points that Churchill was talking about, because, you know, the EU was built to fight, was built to stop France and Germany fighting each other. It was not built to fight anyone else. That's what NATO was for, and that's what your national military is for. But as we've seen, Cameron and Starmer thought it was a great idea. And as well, we can lay the blame with Truss and Theresa May and Sunak and now Starmer, that he thinks that the solution to this problem is to give competence over to the EU in defence and security, both militarily and in terms of procurement. Well, I disagree, because based on what all of the senior military officers that I've ever liaised with, and you can vox pop everybody in the general public on this, and I go, no, don't think so. And I think actually what was very interesting when I aired this, tried to get this in the Brexit campaign, was blocked heavily, although there was a sort of slight foray in the area with vote leave, but they never put it onto the top of the agenda. It kind of came in ancillary. Was that you know, we needed to have this debate at that point, you know, but we were blocked because, you know, it was well, this is going to be a too bitter pill for everybody to sort of swallow, that we're already part way into this thing. It's going to be a bit of a culture shock for everyone. But they're the ones that took out all the fighting capability and reduced our national military to something that could no longer intervene anywhere. Well, you know, and now look where we are. Right. So in conclusion, Liz and ladies and gentlemen, doing nothing is not an option, and remaining silent, you will consent to this by effect, and you will see competence in your own, you know, our own beloved military and security services basically end up in an ever closer union situation with Brussels. Make no bones about it. That's where they want to go with this. They want the whole thing to go through this unification process into defence and security union. The Prime Minister can dress it up with any language he wants, but that's what it is, unless somebody wants to explain or deny that that is not the case. Now, at the moment, of course, there isn't enough resistance, and that needs to change. Now,
David,
so
I think that, excuse me, I think that's very true. What about the engagement of our senior military and security personnel? Is there anybody capable of coming out and actually explaining, like you've just done, to the British public?
Right. So what you need to understand is that senior military officers are not allowed to speak out on any of this sort of thing. All right. Now, in years ago, what used to happen is the just outs used to do it for them on their behalf. That doesn't seem to be happening in this instance. Years ago, and I know many that used to do it in this fashion, where the current in-service head, the general or the admiral or the air marshal would have concerns over government policy, and he would get his mates who were the previous ones who were 2 or 3 years out that would raise the press campaign. That's how it used to be done. That's not happening in this case. Whether that will change or not as the situation deteriorates, I don't know. My worry is that our own government is basically going to create a situation, rather than adapting and increasing fighting capability nationally, they will think that they will do that with the EU, and that will take the EU an awfully long while, because it isn't geared up to fight anyone or anything. That's not what it was built for. It was built to stop France and Germany fighting. It wasn't built to fight anyone else. That's the point. That's what NATO was for. So there are serious issues, but as I've said, silence is consent. Doing nothing is not an option. Pressing your MP in any way you can, particularly, I think the way to do this is to do it in a group, and you can go through any of the ways that you can interface. Obviously, the more the merrier, but sitting back and getting the rebuttal, you will have to press them. You will probably get a put-off letter that they will, because it's defence and security, most MPs don't answer that. That goes off to the Cabinet Office, to something called the Policy Research Unit, where effectively the government will answer on behalf of the MP, and you'll get the kind of brush off. We've seen this before in G19 and in the referendum campaign, where the same letter would come back from all over the country, regardless of the constituency or the colour of the party. You'd get the same template letter coming back from the Cabinet Office, where they would answer for your MP. So they're not even doing their job. So you've got to overcome that, but now you're forewarned, forearmed. I don't want to reply, whatever your MP is, from the PRU in the Cabinet Office. I want you to look at this, and I want you to answer it, and then don't take no for an answer. You're going to have to press them. You're effectively, in the great grand jury public court with this. Now, in conclusion, I want to sum up now, really, and that is, may God save us from this policy. So in conclusion, what we have to have is a real pressing of this campaign, and may God save us and our military from Parliament's silence on this.
Thank you, David, very much. And God will only help us if we help ourselves. So
Correct.
You're quite right.
Absolutely.
We get together. Yeah. Onward Christian soldiers is the old hymn used to say. And we have to come together and really make our presence felt. And unfortunately, things like petitions get worked over. So you're right. It is local people getting together and lobbying your local MP, who might lose his seat, which is the other way that they don't like to think. So we put pressure on. David, I can't thank you enough.
My pleasure. Good luck.